The charge was $86.40, small enough to disappear between a grocery bill and a tank of gas. Small enough that Margaret Hale nearly scrolled past it without a second thought. But something about the name of the clinic made her stop. It was a pediatric clinic. Margaret opened the electronic receipt and read it once. Then she read it again, more slowly. The patient was a 4-year-old boy named Caleb Pierce. Beneath his name was a line that made the room feel suddenly smaller. Father and financial guarantor Daniel Hale. Her husband. The address on the receipt was nearly an hour from their home. Margaret did not call the clinic. She did not accuse Daniel over the phone. She waited until dinner, printed the receipt, and placed it beside his plate. Daniel glanced down at it. That was all. He did not look confused. He did not ask who Caleb was. He did not wonder why a pediatric office had listed him as the boy's father. He barely gave the page a second look. The clinic made a mistake, he said. Then he looked at Margaret with the tired expression he often used when he wanted her to feel unreasonable. You always turn small things into something ugly. That sentence bothered her more than the charge. An innocent man would have had questions. Daniel already had an explanation. If you believe one small detail can expose an entire hidden life, subscribe and stay with Margaret. Because that medical bill was only the first thing Daniel had failed to bury. Margaret had been married to him for 24 years. They were not rich. They did not live in some gated estate. And there was no fortune waiting in a vault. They had a comfortable suburban house with years left on the mortgage. They had a college fund for their daughter Sophie. They owned 2 aging cars that started most mornings and complained through every winter. Their retirement account was not impressive, but it was steady. For a long time, Margaret believed steady would be enough. She worked as an administrative manager at a rehabilitation center. Her days were filled with schedules, insurance forms, staffing problems, and quiet emergencies that became serious the moment everyone else stopped paying attention. Margaret was good at that kind of work. She noticed what people missed. She kept records. She remembered dates. She solved problems before they reached the people in charge. At home, though, she had trusted Daniel to solve his share. Daniel worked as a regional sales manager. His job took him out of town several days each month. Sometimes he stayed overnight. Sometimes an ordinary trip stretched across a weekend. He called the travel the price of keeping the family secure. Margaret believed him. Their marriage was no longer the marriage they had in their 20s. There were no handwritten notes hidden in coat pockets, no last-minute trips, no long evenings spent talking about a future that still felt unlimited. But there had been trust. At least Margaret thought there had. They knew how the other took coffee. They knew which bills had to be paid first when a month ran tight. Together, they had carried Sophie through childhood fevers, school changes, and the strange teenage years when a closed bedroom door could mean anything from heartbreak to homework. Margaret handled the daily structure of the family. She paid school fees. She scheduled medical visits. She reviewed insurance notices, covered the household bills, and kept track of Sophie's activities. She knew when assignments were due, when prescriptions needed refilling, and which teacher had asked for a meeting. Daniel handled the investments, tax documents, bonuses, and the expenses tied to his work. For years, Margaret saw that arrangement as proof that their marriage had matured. They had divided the work. Each person carried a different weight. Neither had to stand over the other. That was what trust looked like to her. Only later did she understand that the same trust had given Daniel a dark corner of their finances. A place she rarely entered because he had spent years telling her there was nothing there she needed to understand. Margaret was not a perfect wife. She would have admitted that without being asked. Some nights, she came home too tired to talk. There were weeks when Sophie needed more from her than Daniel did, and work consumed whatever patience she had left. She knew the marriage had grown quieter. She knew there were subjects they avoided, because neither of them wanted another tired conversation at the end of a long day. There was distance between them, but Margaret thought it was ordinary distance. The kind that settled into a marriage after two people had spent decades raising a child, paying bills, losing parents, changing jobs, and getting older together. She believed ordinary distance could be crossed. She never imagined theirs had a name, an address, and a 4-year-old boy living inside it. Daniel had always said his travel protected their income. Margaret believed that income was paying for their house, Sophie's education, and the retirement they planned to share. She had no idea part of it was already supporting another family. She had never thought to ask how much of their marriage was still intact. The marriage had not fallen apart in one night. Daniel had been removing pieces of it for years. The medical receipt simply showed Margaret where the first empty space had been hiding. Once she stopped accepting the charge as a harmless mistake, older memories began returning with a different meaning. Most of them led back 4 years. That was when Daniel created Hale Regional Consulting LLC. He described it as a simple business arrangement. The company would receive performance bonuses and occasional income from consulting projects. It would separate his outside work from his salary and make tax season easier. Nothing about it sounded threatening. Daniel spoke about it with the dull confidence people use when they expect not to be questioned. Margaret signed the joint tax documents when they arrived and let him handle the rest. Soon after that, the paper statements stopped coming to the house. Daniel said electronic statements were safer. He changed the password on the business account and told Margaret there was no reason for her to worry about work-related transactions. Then his bonuses began shrinking. That part never made sense. Daniel said sales were improving. He spoke about strong quarters and new clients. Yet every year, the amount reaching their household seemed smaller. At the same time, short trips began appearing on weekends. Some lasted one night. Others started late Friday and ended early Sunday. There was always a client, a dinner, a delayed meeting, or a last-minute problem only Daniel could solve. At home, he became strangely strict about money. He complained that Margaret spent too much on Sophie's school activities. He questioned medical expenses that had never bothered him before. He warned that the economy was uncertain and said the family needed to cut back. Margaret cut back, Daniel kept traveling. And while he lectured her about responsibility, he missed parent conferences, medical appointments, school events, and the small moments Sophie quietly waited for him to notice. Whenever Margaret asked for clearer numbers, Daniel never answered the question she had actually asked. He answered a different one. The one where she was the problem. "You don't understand business accounting," Daniel told her. Another time, when Margaret questioned why the numbers never seemed to match his success at work, he gave a small laugh and said, "You're looking for problems because you're unhappy with yourself." And when she asked why one of his weekend trips did not appear on the company calendar, his expression hardened. "I'm working to support this family while you interrogate me." That was how Daniel handled questions. He rarely denied the facts directly. He simply changed the subject until Margaret was defending her tone, her memory, or her right to ask. His choices disappeared from the conversation. Her character took their place. After enough years of that, Margaret began checking herself before she checked him. Maybe she had misunderstood. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe she was becoming suspicious for no reason. That was what made the pattern so effective. Daniel did not need to convince her that every lie was true. He only needed to make her uncertain enough to stop looking. Around that same time, he began talking about selling the house after Sophie graduated. He said it would be too large for 2 people, too expensive to maintain. Too much responsibility as they moved closer to retirement. Margaret had once heard those conversations as sensible planning. She imagined a smaller house, lower bills, maybe a quiet neighborhood near Sophie's college, depending on where she chose to go. After the medical receipt, those same conversations sounded different. Now Margaret wondered whether Daniel had already decided where the money from the house would go. His phone had offered another warning, though it had been easy to dismiss. Daniel often placed it face down on the table. He never grabbed it suddenly. He never looked frightened when it rang. He did not act like a nervous man hiding an affair. He behaved casually. That was almost worse. He turned the screen away with the confidence of someone who had done it so many times that the movement no longer felt secret. And because he looked calm, Margaret felt foolish for noticing. That was the clever part. Nothing looked dramatic on its own. A password changed. A paper statement stopped arriving. A business trip lasted 1 day longer than expected. A bonus became smaller. A phone was placed face down beside a dinner plate. Every detail came with a reasonable explanation. But taken together, they formed a pattern. And that pattern began 4 years earlier. The same year Caleb was born, Margaret finally understood that gaslighting was not only about telling someone a lie, it was about weakening their confidence until they no longer trusted what they could see with their own eyes. She still could not prove Daniel was Caleb's father. Not yet. But she could trace money. And money, unlike Daniel, did not become offended when someone asked where it had been. Margaret did not touch his phone. She did not try to guess his password. She did not install tracking software or enter private accounts that were not legally hers. She stayed inside the boundaries of what she already had the right to review. Their joint checking account, the family HSA, the shared email used for insurance notices, their joint tax returns, credit card statements carrying both names. At first, the transactions looked ordinary. That was what made them difficult to see. They were mixed in with fuel charges, grocery purchases, utility bills, and Sophie's school expenses. Most were not large enough to demand attention. The first was still the charge from the pediatric clinic, $86.40. Then Margaret found another payment, $147 for supplemental medical coverage. A few weeks later, there was a transfer of $720 to a preschool. Then, she found the same amount again the next month, and the month after that. A property management company was receiving $1,850 every month. There were purchases from children's clothing stores, pharmacy charges, payments for furniture, and an education savings account holding more than $18,000. Margaret stared at that number for a long time. She and Daniel had argued over the cost of Sophie's school activities. He had questioned the price of tutoring. He had warned that college would be more expensive than they expected. All the while, he had quietly built another education fund. Daniel's name did not appear next to every payment. Most of the money passed through Hale Regional Consulting LLC first. It entered the company as income, disappeared behind vague labels, and then left in smaller amounts. Consulting expense, client housing, administrative reimbursement. Daniel had not hidden the money by making it vanish. He had hidden it by making it look boring. Margaret began writing everything down. Dates, amounts, account numbers, descriptions. She compared the transfers with their tax returns. She compared them with the months Daniel claimed his bonuses had fallen. The more she examined, the clearer the pattern became. The money had not disappeared because business was slow. It had been redirected before it ever reached their household. Margaret searched the property management company using public records. The company owned several apartment buildings in the area. One address appeared repeatedly beside the monthly payments. She compared it with the pediatric receipt. The apartment was leased to a woman named Lauren Pierce. The address matched Caleb's. Margaret sat completely still. For several minutes, she heard nothing except the quiet hum of the refrigerator. That address changed everything. The pediatric clinic had not made a random mistake. Daniel had not been listed as a father because someone typed the wrong name. He had been paying rent at the same address where Caleb lived. He had paid the boy's medical costs, his preschool tuition, his insurance, his future education. That was the first answer Margaret could no longer explain away. She spread the statements across the dining table. There were 4 years of them. 4 years of ordinary-looking charges hidden between the expenses of the life Daniel claimed to be protecting. Margaret's first instinct was to call him. She wanted to hear him struggle for an explanation. She wanted to place every statement in front of him and ask how many mistakes one financial system could make before it became a second family. But anger was exactly what Daniel expected from her, and she remembered what happened the first time she asked about Caleb. He did not explain the receipt. He attacked her reaction to it. If she confronted him now, the accounts might change. Passwords could be replaced. Records could disappear. Money could move somewhere she would never find it. So Margaret made the hardest decision she had made in 24 years of marriage. She said nothing. She downloaded every statement she was legally allowed to access. She saved copies on a personal device Daniel could not reach. She made a separate list of transfers connected to the LLC. Then she scheduled a meeting with a divorce attorney. At home, Margaret kept her voice steady. She asked Daniel whether he wanted dinner. She answered simple questions. She listened as he complained about traffic and spoke about a client meeting, as though the life around them had not already changed. Daniel noticed that she had stopped asking about the medical bill. He took her silence as proof that his explanation had worked. By Friday, he was kinder than he had been in months. He brought home the coffee she liked. He offered to take her to dinner. He said they had both been stressed and needed time alone together. Margaret watched him smile across the kitchen. Once, that smile would have reassured her. Now it showed her something else. A man could support a second household for 4 years and still remember exactly how his wife took her coffee. Daniel's kindness did not mean he was innocent. It meant he believed he was safe. The medical charge had connected him to Caleb. Caleb's address had connected him to Lauren's apartment. The LLC connected that apartment to money belonging to Daniel and Margaret's marriage. She still did not know whether Caleb was truly Daniel's son. She did not know when the affair began, what Daniel had promised Lauren, or how much money had been taken from the future Margaret thought they were building together. But she finally understood what came next. She would stop arguing with Daniel's explanations. She would stop asking him for a truth he had already decided not to give her. She would let the records speak. 3 weeks later, the DNA result arrived. Daniel Hale was Caleb Pierce's biological father. The probability was greater than 99.9%. Margaret read the result alone. There was no dramatic scream, no shattered glass, no moment when the room spun around her. There was only a number on a page, a number that confirmed what Daniel had denied at the kitchen table. The DNA test did not create the truth. It simply removed the last place Daniel could hide from it. Suddenly, every payment had a meaning. The clinic, the apartment, the insurance, the preschool, the education account. 4 years of hidden money now led back to a child Daniel had looked Margaret in the eye and claimed not to know. But the test did more than connect Daniel to Caleb. It also destroyed the version of the story he had been telling Lauren. Lauren believed Margaret already knew about the boy. Daniel had told her his marriage existed only on paper. He said he stayed in the house because Sophie was still in school. He claimed Margaret and he had quietly agreed to separate once their daughter graduated. He promised that the house would be sold. He promised part of the money would complete the purchase of a small condo, where he, Lauren, and Caleb could finally live together. To Lauren, the LLC was a way to protect their future. To Margaret, it was a way to protect the family Daniel already had. The same company, the same money. Two completely different stories. After the DNA result, Lauren discovered that Daniel had formally denied being Caleb's father. She also learned he had told Margaret that the clinic made a mistake. For the first time, Lauren understood that Daniel had not been delaying a difficult decision. He had been lying to both women and waiting to see how long he could keep both lives running. That was when Lauren stopped protecting him. Through her attorney, she turned over records Daniel never expected Margaret to see. There were messages where Daniel referred to Caleb as "my son." There were photographs of him at birthday parties he had described at home as business dinners. There were emails about preschool tuition, insurance coverage, and medical appointments. There were documents related to the condo deposit. And there was a message in which Daniel promised Lauren that selling the marital home would provide the money they needed to complete the purchase. By then, the affair was no longer the worst part of the betrayal. Daniel had built a second life, not with one careless mistake, with rent payments, school fees, financial accounts, false business records, and promises made to two women who had been living inside different versions of his future. At home, Daniel continued behaving as if nothing had changed. He ate dinner with Sophie. He asked about school. He complained about traffic, clients, and the endless demands of work. He sat at the same table where Margaret had shown him the medical receipt and spoke with the calm confidence of a man who still believed he controlled the story. By then, his life had already been divided between two homes. But he carried himself like a husband with only one. Margaret let him believe she was still uncertain. During the day, she kept Sophie's life as steady as she could. She went to work, she answered school emails, she made dinner, she checked homework, scheduled appointments, and kept the ordinary pieces of the household moving. At night, after Sophie went to bed, Margaret opened the files. She reviewed bank records with Grace Bennett, her attorney. She organized statements for the forensic accountant. She compared travel dates with payments near Lauren's apartment. She began preparing for the temporary custody and financial hearing. It was a strange way to live. Daniel was in the next room, moving through the house as though he still belonged to the future he had promised Margaret. And Margaret was quietly documenting the 4 years he had spent financing another one. Daniel mistook her restraint for fear. He believed she was overwhelmed. He believed she still needed him to explain the accounts, manage the taxes, and tell her what the numbers meant. Most of all, he believed silence meant she was not ready to leave. Then the divorce papers arrived. They came with a formal request to preserve financial records and prevent unusual transfers from the accounts connected to the marriage and the LLC. Daniel came home angry, not frightened, not ashamed. Angry. He walked into the kitchen holding the papers and demanded to know why Margaret had gone to an attorney without speaking to him first. The question was almost insulting. Margaret had spoken to him. She had placed the receipt beside his dinner plate. She had asked why his name appeared beneath a 4-year-old boy's. Daniel had answered by calling her suspicious and unreasonable. Now he stood in front of her, acting as though she had denied him an honest conversation. Margaret took the DNA report from the folder on the counter. She placed it on the table between them. "I did ask you," she said. "You told me the clinic made a mistake." Daniel stared at the page. For several seconds, he said nothing. There was nowhere left for his usual confidence to go. The result was simple. He was Caleb's father. The payments were real, and Margaret already knew enough that another quick explanation would not make the evidence disappear. Finally, Daniel said the situation was complicated. That word seemed to arrive whenever the truth became too clear. Complicated. He said Lauren had pressured him. He claimed he had wanted to tell Margaret, but had never found the right time. He said he was trying to protect Sophie. Then he said he had been trying to protect Lauren and Caleb, too. Daniel wanted Margaret to believe he had spent 4 years carrying an impossible burden for everyone else. He spoke as though the secrecy had been an act of sacrifice. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not give him the emotional scene he could later describe as proof that she was unstable. "You did not protect 2 families," she said. "You financed one with money stolen from the other." Daniel's face changed. He told her the money had been his. Margaret reminded him that much of it came from income earned during their marriage. Money he had hidden while telling her they could not afford Sophie's expenses. Daniel said he had planned to replace it. He said he had always intended to make everything right. But people who intend to make something right do not hide it for 4 years. And they do not deny their own child when the truth reaches a courtroom. When the financial explanation failed, Daniel changed direction. He brought up Sophie. He said divorce would destroy their daughter. He accused Margaret of tearing apart the family because she was angry with him. He said Sophie needed both parents in the same home. That was the old pattern. Daniel's choices disappeared from the conversation. Margaret's response became the real offense. For years, that had been enough to make her doubt herself. This time, it was not. Margaret told him. Sophie would not be used as a shield against consequences. Their daughter would have stability. She would have honesty. She would have both parents in her life, whenever that was healthy and appropriate. But she would not be raised to believe that betrayal had to be tolerated just to preserve the appearance of a whole family. A house was not stable simply because 2 married people still slept under the same roof. Not when one of them was living a second life. Not when every dinner sat on top of another lie. Daniel told Margaret she was making a permanent decision while emotional. She looked at the folders on the table. 4 years of rent. 4 years of insurance. 4 years of school payments. 4 years of hidden transfers. There was nothing impulsive about what Daniel had done. And there was nothing impulsive about her response. Margaret left the room before he could turn the conversation into another trial of her character. For years, Daniel had separated his lies. One account for work, one account for the family. One address for Margaret and Sophie. Another for Lauren and Caleb. One story for his wife. Another for the woman waiting for him to leave. He believed separation would keep the truth manageable. In court, all of it was placed into the same file. The judge did not focus on dramatic accusations. The court focused on records. Grace presented the financial trail in a clear order. Daniel had controlled the complicated parts of the family finances. He had routed income through Hale Regional Consulting LLC. He had reported smaller bonuses to Margaret while directing money elsewhere. He had used marital income to pay rent, medical bills, school fees, insurance costs, furniture, and vehicle expenses connected to Lauren and Caleb. He had also placed money toward a condo that Lauren believed would become their family home. Daniel tried to describe some of the transfers as business expenses. Others, he said, were voluntary gifts. But voluntary gifts did not usually arrive every month in the exact amount of someone's rent. Business expenses did not usually pay preschool tuition for the owner's biological child. The forensic accountant showed the pattern. The payments began around the time Caleb was born. They continued for 4 years. They increased as the child's needs changed, and many of them matched the dates when Daniel told Margaret that his bonuses were lower than expected. The DNA result connected Daniel to Caleb. His messages connected him to the promises he made Lauren. The bank records connected those promises to money taken from the marriage. Then custody became part of the case. After learning that child support would be calculated, Daniel requested equal parenting time with Sophie. He described himself as a deeply involved father who had always shared the daily responsibilities. Margaret did not tell the court that Daniel had never loved his daughter. That would not have been true. Daniel loved Sophie. But love and daily caregiving were not the same thing. Margaret brought records. She had medical appointment histories showing who attended, school emails showing who answered, pickup schedules, activity calendars, messages where Daniel canceled family weekends, travel records, emergency contact logs from Sophie's school. There were also dates when Daniel claimed to be traveling for business, while purchases placed him near Lauren's apartment. The documents showed a simple truth. Margaret had carried most of Sophie's daily life. Daniel wanted credit for half the parenting after years of doing far less than half the work. Grace did not need to call him a liar. The calendar did that for her. The court kept Sophie's primary residence with Margaret. Daniel received structured parenting time. He was not removed from his daughter's life. But his request for immediate equal custody was not accepted simply because it would have reduced his financial obligation. His actual income, including the money routed through the LLC, was considered when support was calculated. The value of the company was examined as part of the marital estate. The condo deposit was traced back to marital funds. A portion of the money used to support the hidden household was treated as money improperly taken from the marriage. Daniel had to account for it in the final division. He was also ordered to contribute toward the added legal and forensic accounting costs created by his failure to disclose the finances honestly. In the separate paternity matter, Daniel became legally responsible for Caleb as well. The result was not some dramatic punishment where he lost everything overnight. That would have been easy. Reality was quieter, and in many ways harder. Daniel could no longer maintain 2 homes using hidden money. The condo plan collapsed. His bonuses could no longer disappear before reaching the financial disclosures. He had obligations to both children. The retirement plan he once controlled had to be divided, honestly. He did not become poor. He simply lost the advantage that secrecy had given him. Lauren did not get the future Daniel had promised her. Once she understood that he had denied Caleb to protect himself, whatever trust remained between them disappeared. She had believed Margaret was aware of the child. She had believed the marriage was already over. That did not remove Lauren's responsibility for becoming involved with a married man. But it did make one thing clear. Daniel had lied to her too. He had built the promised condo with money that partly belonged to Margaret. He had described that theft as security. Lauren eventually stepped away from the plan she had spent years waiting for. She did not win Daniel. Margaret did not want him back. And Daniel was left facing the part of his life he had tried hardest to avoid. Consequences without an audience he could manipulate. After one of the hearings, Daniel told Margaret that everyone had taken a single mistake and used it to destroy him financially. Margaret did not argue. She had learned there was no value in debating a man who needed every consequence to become someone else's cruelty. She looked at him and said, "One mistake does not require 4 years of rent, tuition, insurance, and false statements." Then she walked away. Months later, Margaret stopped measuring her life by what Daniel had taken from her. She began measuring it by what remained. She and Sophie moved into a smaller townhouse. It was not a mansion. Margaret did not become wealthy overnight. There was no dramatic reinvention, no perfect new life waiting behind the front door. There was only peace. The bills made sense. The custody schedule stayed on the refrigerator. Margaret understood every account in her name. Sophie chose the color of her own bedroom walls and arranged the shelves the way she wanted them. At dinner, no one placed a phone face down beside a plate. No one had to study Daniel's mood before deciding whether it was safe to ask a question. The silence in the townhouse felt different. It was not the silence of suspicion. It was rest. Margaret still hurt. 24 years did not disappear because a judge signed an order. There were mornings when grief reached her before she was fully awake. There were memories she could no longer separate from the lies surrounding them. A vacation, an anniversary dinner, a weekend when Daniel said he was working. She sometimes wondered which moments had been real and which ones had simply been convenient. But she no longer waited for Daniel to answer that question. He had lost the right to define her memories. Margaret accepted that he would always be Sophie's father. He would appear at graduations, birthdays, and other important days. Redemption did not mean removing Daniel from every corner of their lives. It meant he no longer controlled the truth inside those corners. Margaret kept working. She adjusted her retirement plans. The future was smaller than the one she had imagined. But it was honest. She had less money than she once expected. What remained was visible. It was real. And she could finally plan around the truth instead of Daniel's promises. Sophie slowly became steadier too. She did not need every adult detail. Margaret never used the affair, or Caleb, to poison her daughter against her father. Sophie only needed to understand that serious lies had changed the family, and that none of it was her fault. Over time, she stopped listening for arguments through the walls. She stopped wondering whether another secret was about to arrive at the dinner table. Margaret sometimes thought about the original charge. $86.40. It had looked too small to matter. But that payment had not destroyed the marriage. It had only opened the door. The room behind it had already existed for 4 years. Daniel had built that room. He filled it with hidden accounts, false trips, divided promises, and money taken from a future Margaret believed they shared. All Margaret did was turn on the light. In the end, she did not leave with revenge. She left with clarity. She left with her daughter protected. She left with her dignity intact. And for the first time in years, she was no longer waiting for someone else to tell her what was real. Sometimes power does not look like winning everything. Sometimes it looks like understanding the truth before the lies can take anything more. It looks like keeping records, getting the right help, refusing to use children as weapons, and choosing peace, even when peace comes in a smaller house than the one you plan to grow old in. Subscribe for more stories about betrayal, divorce, custody battles, and the quiet strength it takes to begin again.